Good morning and welcome to the first show of the year. I am Jeff Winder. I'm the founder and principal of Healthcare Strategy Bullpen. We're a digital healthcare consulting firm. And before I start, I did want to remind you that Diagnosing Health Tech is now available on all of your favorite podcast apps. So please go ahead and subscribe. And with that, I'd like to welcome our guest, Ryan Halstead. Ryan is a managing director of the Gilman Group in New York. Today, we're going to talk about the JPM Healthcare Conference, the 42nd annual JPM Healthcare Conference, and what we've seen, some of the key themes and takeaways. Ryan has over 15 years of experience in the capital markets, in both providing advisory services and analysis to both public and private equity companies. Ryan, prior to joining the Gilman Group, spent 5 years at Marwood, where he offered private equity and corporate advisory services. And prior to that, Ryan was an equity research analyst at Wells Fargo, covering healthcare services. So Ryan has a really broad and deep background in healthcare services. And it's my pleasure to welcome you, Ryan.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
So Ryan, before we start, for those who aren't familiar with the Gilman Group and what you do, can you tell us a little bit about what the Gilman Group is and kind of what you were trying to get out of JP Morgan?
Sure. Good morning to all for joining. So as Jeff mentioned, I lead the tech-enabled healthcare services, digital health, and healthcare IT team at the Gilman Group. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the Gilman Group, we are a healthcare dedicated investor relations advisory firm. We represent over 125 healthcare clients, and we work across all verticals within healthcare. So, med tech and devices, biotech, tools and diagnostics, and then again, the digital health healthcare IT team that I lead. Our clients are both public and private clients. And really, we help companies navigate Wall Street and the investor community and how to clearly articulate their investment story and meet with investors. So the JP Morgan conference is still a leading investor conference, and we were very active. Again, this year, we had about 90 clients participate at the conference, either both presenting in the conference or outside of the conference. We hosted about 1,800 meetings over the 3 days. In terms of what we saw, while we were very active, there was some modest decline, I think, in attendance across the institutional investors. I think we saw institutional investors maybe down about 5 to 10% versus last year. But participation amongst our corporate clients, amongst the sell side, we're still very active. And, I think the JP Morgan conference is still a huge event for meetings, both with, Wall Street and strategics. And we think that's an area that was very much appreciated by those participants. And then lastly, I would just say, the dialogue we saw with investors that were there is still very active, and there's still a significant need for companies to be able to communicate their story and work to be done amongst those investors to understand it. So, we felt like it was a great event, and we were active.
Thanks, Ryan. That's really interesting, and I just wanted to pick up on your comment about attendance, because it was interesting that you saw less institutional investor attendance, because one of the things that I noted and we talked about before was that it does seem like the events broadened out a little bit beyond the traditional people looking for funding, people supplying funding kind of investor base, because there was a Valid AI, future of healthcare event on Sunday, which unfortunately I had to miss because my flights got messed up with the Boeing Alaska Air debacle. But, that was very well attended, very well done from what I understand. I attended another event that was hosted by McDermott and E&Y. That was very well attended. So a lot of these kind of events on the periphery seem to be getting a little bit bigger as well. And, tried to meet with a couple of strategics while I was there. And, some of the strategics were just so busy. A number of them didn't have time. So that's really interesting. So let's get to the number one question that everybody always has coming out of JP Morgan. What did you see in terms of the funding environment? And let's kind of take it in three pieces. First, kind of, the VC funding environment. I ran into a number of VCs. And talked to a number of them in pre-planned meetings. It seemed to be a little bit tighter. A lot of people raising, not as many people having the ability to get the funding that they wanted, and just wondering what you saw.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. The funding environment is still challenging, and I think the IPO window remains closed at the moment. To I guess cite a recent report from Rock Health, digital health companies capital raises were down nearly 30% this year versus last year. And I think that reflects a lot of the headwinds that we're all pretty aware of, which are, the macro environment is not great. The higher interest rate environment has been a headwind for capital raises. So that, but one of my sell side counterparts actually made a good point, which is if you compare activity today versus 2019, and we're still sort of in line, or there's still a more normalized environment compared to the more heavily, the more active recent years. One other I thought interesting takeaway from this Rock Health report was the higher proportion of silent rounds, or those rounds funded by insiders offering the additional capital. Those were, I think, over 40% of those raises, which was almost a doubling. And I think what that reflects is that there's still a disconnect between valuations today from external investors and valuations that insiders and internal investors want, that sort of were reflective of when they did a past deal. And so that disconnect, I think, continues to be a bit of an overhang, especially as you think about the IPO window.
Yeah, one of the things we saw and that we ran into was a number of firms just talking about kind of delaying or deferring. There was an article in Stat, I believe, talking about how I think Sword Health, Somatis, a couple of others were probably thinking that the IPO window would hopefully open up later in 2024, maybe early 25. Any sense, on your end, a ton of PE firms out there, looks like they're, looking to continue their big investment in healthcare. Any thoughts on, what you saw in terms of, PE investment or your interactions with PE investors?
Sure. I think PE investors, have continued to be active in the space, but I think in terms of potential exits, again, when we're talking about maybe the IPO window, I think there's still a view that that they're going to be patient and that they're going to continue to were companies that can fund further growth and scaling and achieve and get either become profitable or have a clear pathway to becoming profitable in the near term. I mean, I think that's the priority. One of the things, though, that came out of the conference that I thought was interesting is, one thing that could change is, LPs and sort of a desire to realize a return on their investments could end up being a bit of an impetus for an IPO window. If there becomes a little bit of a degree of urgency around some of these funds really wanting to, realize some gains or some returns on their investment so that they can, look towards the next investment, that might drive the IPO window.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I saw is that the three criteria that really people elaborated were one, the Fed and rates. How quickly does the Fed get to the point where they start cutting rates and capital loosens up a little bit? Number two is firms, both venture capital, PE, and others looking for their investments to really focus not as much on growth, but having these businesses be good, solid, long-term, sustainable businesses. And then three, it's a function of really where the sectors are. So talk to me a little bit about, and with that, I would say, just a brief comment, and then I'll ask my question. Excuse me. Is obviously everybody was talking about AI, a ton of stuff in drugs and drug discovery, a lot of the GLP-1s. What did you see in terms of sectors that stood out for you?
Sure. In terms of sector themes.
Yeah, sector themes of what were the themes in the different sectors, and were there different sectors that you thought were better positioned coming out of the conference for 2024 than some others?
Sure. So, you alluded to one big sector theme that I thought was very prominent at JP Morgan this year was AI in digital health and healthcare IT. And I think
AI everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion was kind of balanced between near term, what are some, realistic applications that can be accomplished, and then longer term, what are some more transformative use cases. And so I think thinking about it from those two angles, on the near term, it's really about automation and focusing on administrative tasks. So think about like revenue cycle management companies, thinking about uses of AI for patient engagement, billing and coding assistance were themes. And then longer term, you saw companies talking about investments towards wanting to use generative AI for chart abstraction. And company like Innovator announced an interesting opportunity around ambient clinical intelligence and clinical decision support. And then to your point, clinical trials and clinical trial optimization, I think, is an area where there's a use case.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing is the NVIDIA presentation by their VP of Healthcare was overflowing, standing room only, people out in the hall. I actually had to listen to the recording. But, one of the things I would say is differentiating between what you, quite appropriately referred to as those near-term opportunities and longer ones. And actually, I think being careful to distinguish between where there's a real opportunity very near term, because one of the points they made was their technology, which is very focused on drug discovery, or their presentation was very focused on drug discovery, was talking about how they could reduce the time to find and look at and eliminate drug candidates, by about 7x, and they were basically equating that to a 7x reduction in the cost of drug development. And I think that was a misnomer. Drug discovery preclinical work is roughly only about a third of that cost. So if they can do that, maybe you'll reduce that cost significantly, but you won't reduce it 7x. So I would say looking at those is certainly one area. Were there other areas that you thought stood out?
Yeah, well, but maybe before I kind of go, just to add on, part of, I think, the investment in AI and the use cases of AI, one theme that stood out to me is really, companies that have a robust data and analytics. So maybe kind of adding on to the life sciences end market, there was really a lot of interesting companies talking about real world data and emphasizing multimodal data, which I thought was interesting, talking about having access to not just claims data or encounter data, but also genetic data and radiological data. That seems to becoming kind of the standard of data analytics in life sciences. And then IT companies that have access to de-identified patient encounter data and the robustness of that, and the use cases that could be applied across a broader spectrum of healthcare, I thought was a kind of a takeaway that lends to where AI is going.
Right. Any comments or Hemant Taneja from General Catalyst, they talked about their investment in Harbor. He talked a lot about consolidation in the hospital space. Obviously, they have made their investment in Summa Health, but I heard a decent amount of talk about consolidation in the hospital space, and also about some of the MCOs, managed care companies, maybe having a little bit more difficult time of it because of two things. One is the Medicare Advantage and the HCC risk coding adjustment, as well as the fact that they're going to be the focus, along with the PBMs, of what's going on in Capitol Hill, because they're a target that everybody loves to hate. And two parties can't get along, but they love to hate both the drug and the insurance companies. So any thoughts from your side on that?
Yeah, so maybe just kind of starting with what you were alluding to towards the latter part of your comments, which was, kind of the pressures that a lot of the large MCOs called out really leading up to the JP Morgan conference, where there's been elevated utilization trends, both somewhat, some inpatient, but also very much on an outpatient basis when it comes to surgeries. And that's been, there were a few companies that, pre-announced or issued guidance that reflected some concerns around those elevated utilization trends. That's, not good for MCOs, and some capitated provider groups.
Yeah.
But that's a positive for hospitals and health systems and other outpatient care providers. Those trends were kind of reaffirmed at JP Morgan. I mean, you heard some companies came out and actually added to those trends, or added comments around those trends, saying they continued into the fourth quarter, and that I think it was CVS called out, that there's been further elevated utilization trends. I know you saw Humana actually reported this morning that they too saw similar trends into the fourth quarter. So that was certainly a topic on the top of investors' minds leading into the conference, and it kind of seemed to only be a little bit more exacerbated and added and built upon during the conference.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Maybe though, just to kind of transition though to kind of the initial part of your comment or question was, so what has that meant for, I guess, future consolidation in the space? I mean, I think there's still a great emphasis on like ambulatory healthcare. You saw some activity in ambulatory infusion, right? I think it was Elevance that made an acquisition in that space. The home setting is still an area where there's a lot of emphasis and investment. I think it was Cigna talked about wanting to explore M&A in that sector. So I think those themes had been a big area of focus in past JP Morgans and kind of still are.
Yeah, I mean, I would tack onto that. I think a couple of things is well, one is, the home definitely being a focus. While we were there, CVS made an investment in WellBe Senior Care. which is a home player, predominantly sending people into the home for, polychronic people. And I think that was a reflection also of the thought process coming out of JPM, that there are going to be, I think, a combination of more consolidation, particularly in the provider space, and more partnerships. I personally favor, I think, the consolidation model, because I think the partnership sometimes can be, tougher to, see work, particularly with all the needs for information. And then just kind of getting to your earlier comment, across the board, you saw people, also in the device space, in radiology and others, looking at ways that they can use AI and the information they get out of AI to make, drug development more efficient, quicker, but also help recruit the right people, for clinical trials, help get them in, help get them, in certain cases, get some of the underserved access to clinical trials. In terms of radiology, help reducing some of the workforce strain on radiologists by having the AI pre-process some of these scans and then separate them into ones which need more detailed human attention, and more in the back office. Any other sectors that kind of caught your eye?
Sure. I think there's still a lot of really interesting companies and a lot of investment interest in specialty care. So thinking about, provider groups or digital health companies that address metabolic disease, MSK, chronic kidney disease, really a lot of interesting companies there with innovative models and innovative technologies. Fertility care is a really exciting space. Value-based care is certainly still an area where I think there's a lot of room for growth, and you're seeing a lot of companies talking about that huge white space. So I think a lot of enthusiasm in both the public and private companies that are telling their story, and those are just a few. Many. I know you alluded to a little bit on the life sciences and kind of pharma services space, and seeing a lot of really interesting companies similarly talking about how AI can really I think impact that value chain.
Yeah, I mean, the one other thing I saw is also even, in oncology, you saw a lot more kind of looking at, potential biomarkers and other types of predictive analytics you could do, in terms of oncology, to try to look at people and even look at some of the, the scan data that we talked about in radiology, where it's obviously been a huge use of AI, to start looking at earlier scans of people who may have eventually, unfortunately, had cancer. Were there things that were not of concern typically to a radiologist that may have started to look concerning? So let's talk a little bit about, we talked about the MA companies. One thing that I've also heard recently, both at the conference and outside, is there's the risk, from the, Medicare risk adjustment models. And I heard that talked about a lot in a couple of places, and that could be a little bit more of a hurdle for some of the MA companies. And you alluded to the higher utilization. I didn't know if you heard anything. One thing I have heard is there's been some pent-up demand for the MA companies, and have seen people who fail to get cancer screenings and the like coming into hospitals and providers with later stage disease, and that's costing the insurance companies more money. Have you seen that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the large MCOs that have made public comments about it did cite as drivers of this elevated utilization trends. I mentioned surgeries or procedure volumes. So cardiac or ortho procedures was specifically cited. And then on like the Part B drug utilization, I mean, I think, there was some that cited an uptick in oncology drugs as perhaps being a driver of that. But then also, things like just RSV, visits to get, vaccinations or so it wasn't as clear in terms of how widespread this was, but clearly multiple large MCO groups cited this as concerns through the fourth quarter, although it really wasn't reflected in 2024 guidance that many companies had issued. So it may be isolated to really just being current trends. Although that's something that I think a lot of investors are a bit concerned about is how predictable is this really, in terms of the go forward.
Yeah. Just one thing, let me pause for 1 second. So for those of you out there, please feel free to ask questions. We'd love to make this, interactive dialogue. So if you do have questions, things on your mind, please, feel free to, pop a question in. Ryan and I, would certainly love to entertain your questions. And it does appear we do have a question. So if you could just pop that up on the screen, David, I would appreciate it. Let me see. Pardon me. I might be getting old here. Seems to be quite an emphasis on real world. I can't see it. I think that's real world evidence, multimodal data, and using AI applications to aid in the analysis of with AI being introduced in Europe in the year. Was there any thinking that the U.S. will follow on the such as risk or I got to get bigger. I got to get better glasses, or got to get bigger print, David. Or that scrutiny may add for wide adoption of these technologies. So I apologize. I didn't read that very well, but it sounds like they're talking about the use of real world data, real world evidence in AI applications, and the AI Act in Europe, and what we follow suit in terms of. I believe what they're talking about is would there be something like the AI Act in the U.S. and what might that do for the adoption of technology? So the Biden administration did introduce some rules and regulations. There's been a lot of pushback. I think the industry is really trying to move towards self-regulation, kind of on the idea of FINRA and what they're doing in the securities markets. But Ryan, I'll let you comment on what your thoughts are on something like an AI Act coming into the U.S. To regulate the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I don't have a view on kind of the policy outlook around, regulating AI. But I do think it seems that there's been considerable investment and progress made amongst companies that, are really showing tremendous value to the life sciences space. And so it seems like, I don't know, I'm not sure, again, if policymakers are really looking to want to dampen that progress. But to your point, Jeff, there's certainly been a lot of discussion amongst DC on understanding what's happening in AI and really just trying to make sure that they're wrapping their heads around it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would add is one of the points made at the NVIDIA presentation was they were talking about, the ability to move drug discovery and clinicals into kind of an engineering mindset. And the one caution I would have is, roughly a third of drug discovery is the R&D. finding the compounds, et cetera. But, 2/3 or at least 2/3 of the cost is really the clinical trials and clinical efficacy and side effects and all that. And that still involves humans. And there's a number of pathways and roadways being discovered there, such as digital twins. But my impression is that is not going to be allowed by the FDA and, push forward, really quickly. So I still think you have to make sure you understand, what are the inroads that AI can make. And I think Ryan made great points is some of the first places that we can really make some, really good progress is in automation or in speeding some of this, back office work in getting transcription of patient events, in looking into different things we can do with radiology. So I think just really bifurcating that look. And so I think that's interesting. Excuse me, one other, any other questions, David, before I move on? So I will take that as a no. So another question I had is one of the things, heard quite a bit of talk about at some of the policy sessions, and obviously a number of DC people floating around, is, in terms of PBMs and the desire for, both on the part of some of the public, but also in particularly part of the Congress, desire for more transparency. There's legislation on the Hill for, desiring, more transparency on PBMs. It does seem like that's a viable target, this year, particularly in an election year. Did you hear anything on that, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency around the pharma supply chain certainly is a major focus. And, I think investors are still kind of trying to understand exactly what's that going to mean. There's been some interesting new models that kind of fit within the idea of a more transparent pharma supply chain. And I think those have been all received relatively favorably by the investor community, but, with a lot of question still outstanding in terms of how is it really going to impact kind of the overall economics. But, maybe kind of taking a step back in terms of, you talked about the election. That was an area where the election was a key topic of conversation around the conference. And I think the takeaway is that it's not likely going to have as much of an impact on healthcare as perhaps past elections, meaning it's not a huge campaign issue this year. If you think about past elections where, there's been a lot of rhetoric around repeal and replace of the ACA, I don't think that's an expectation this year. And so it seemed like election conversation was kind of quickly addressed and kind of moved on at JP Morgan.
It's interesting. I heard a couple of those, and I didn't know how far you wanted to get into this because I know this isn't, actually your area of expertise or frankly mine, but there was, a couple of people at the E&Y conference were talking about, presidential election way too close to call, even people who typically make a call. It did look that the most people were seeming to say the Republicans would maintain control of the House, but a little closer than they thought. And Senate's a little bit of a toss-up. I didn't know if you would agree with those conclusions, or feel free to beg off on that one, Ryan.
Yeah, no, I'll kind of back off. I don't have a view in terms of the election outcome. Just meant that election can be a bit of a complicated overhang on aspects of healthcare, and I think it was pretty quickly somewhat dismissed that it shouldn't be an overhang if you think about my sector.
The one thing that I was surprised at, now that we're talking about it, is typically going into an election at least this close, you would have some clearly elaborated issues both on the part of the presumptive, Republican nominee, President Trump, at least, at this point, or even, Governor Haley or Governor DeSantis, and, more clear initiatives that he wanted to focus on, going forward for President Biden. And there was really not a lot of talk of that, which you didn't get. And I'm surprised this close going into an election. So, just interested in that. Once again, any other questions, please do, feel free to lob them in. So Ryan, we've covered a lot of ground here. Was there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to chat about?
Yeah, I mean, maybe coming back to the conversation around an IPO window, while I mentioned that currently it's considered closed or it's closed, you did see a company like BrightSpring Health announced today that they're proceeding with its IPO. So you do have a company that's in the home care, pharmacy, and services space. They cater to a chronic population, and I think that's a sign of hope that the IPO window could reopen. And I think a lot of people feel like the latter part of 2024 is a potential opportunity to see the IPO window reopen. I think, you think about a company like Waystar, that's a healthcare IT revenue cycle management company. They had previously shelved their plans and stated that they would consider revisiting later in 2024, which feels like a consistent view.
Yeah, no, I do think, there's definitely, and they had the CEO of Morgan Stanley on CNBC this morning, and there's definitely a lot of pent up demand. So once you get, I think, a little bit of a crack or a little bit of an opening in that IPO window, it might be a little faster than some people expect. But I do think there'll be a definite emphasis on a more distinct emphasis on fundamentals going forward than there was in the last round.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to add on that, I mean, I think you're seeing companies that are remaining patient, focusing on scaling their business, getting profitable, cash flow positive, or at least have clear pathway there. And really looking to make sure that when the IPO window reopens, there's signs that it'll be durable. And then, yeah, I do think there's going to be a pretty decent backlog of companies that may look to access the capital markets. And it's going to be important to be prepared from a public company readiness perspective.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would also add is there were less, for those who have not been to JP Morgan, there are a slew of networking events, parties, both Monday, Tuesday, sometimes Wednesday night. And when you go to these, you're obviously approached by people. And I would say there were less people with a hope and a prayer and an idea that, I can get funding for this and make it work. And more people who had real businesses that were established and that, looking to, put that forward. I ran into a lot less people, I would say, this year, who were just, hey, I had this idea and it seems to, make sense to me. And if I can just, convince some other people, we'll make it work. Any thoughts on anything like that from you, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the companies that are, considering or looking at a potential IPO window are certainly, already pretty scaled or have really been using the past few years to really focus on scaling the business. And you're hearing more companies talking about profitability and cash runway, and have the luxury of being a little patient while they continue to grow profitably.
Yeah, no, I agree. Anything else you wanted to add before we wrap it up, Ryan?
No, I think we covered most of my takeaways. So I think this has been great.
Well, Ryan, I really appreciate it. I know for everyone that actually coming back from JP Morgan, doing a lot of follow up is a busy time. The week after is very busy, so I do appreciate your time. Do appreciate your questions, folks. Please do feel free to connect with either myself or Ryan on LinkedIn. You can find us at Healthcare Pen on Twitter and at Healthcare Bullpen on LinkedIn. Our show is brought to you by the Healthcare Strategy Bullpen, and we are consultants that help innovators and payers and providers move their technology into the system to help improve the quality and reduce the cost of care. And the show is also brought to you by our sponsor Redox. And we look for you. So glad we could be back New Year's, and look for you next week where we'll have Marty Mojinin, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Marty. Marty will be from CDW, and he'll talk a lot about some of the steps to implementing technology and technology changes, and a couple of other topics next week. And we have a great set of guests, for this year. We also have Sherry Galid, who is the Dean of the Wagner School of Public Policy at NYU, coming up. Sherry is going to talk about Medicare and some Medicare cost trends and some of the data that she's been looking at. We also have Jenny Shulkin from Override Health to talk about pain management. So please do join us. Please do sign up on your favorite podcast app. And we thank you and look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks very much. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.